nothing. And I would have these moments where I'd be like, how the hell did I end up here? You know, this one moment in time next to an aircraft landing on a boat in the middle of the ocean, you know. Where did my life, you know, how did my life go to end up here? How interesting. But what I did start to enjoy was the night vision goggles and putting those on and looking up at the stars flying around, especially over the ocean.
What do they look like?
There's just so many. There's just so many stars that, you know, you normally can't see. They're shooting stars all the time. Almost every flight you'd see them with the goggles on. So it was a great pleasure to take advantage of the lack of light pollution in some cases, especially on deployment, to go grab some goggles at night, go out some quiet spot in the ship that no one can see me, and just kind of look around, you know.
Yeah, it's humbling. Quick break? Bathroom break?
I wouldn't mind a quick stretch of legs.
You got a few cool patches.
I do. So this is VFA 11 Red Rippers patch, typically going actually on our arm. So this is actually what we call the boar's head, or Arnold. So this is actually the boar's head from the Gordon's Gin model. So yeah, in 1918 we were in London or the UK somewhere, and we apparently partied with the owner and founder of Gordon's Gin. We had a great time, and there's a signed letter in our ready room that says we can use the logo in perpetuity.
Oh, nice.
And yeah, so I'd like to give you that patch.
I drank quite a bit of Gord, so this is good.
And I'd like to give you that coin from our squadron.
The Red Rippers. That's a badass name. Thank you, brother.
You're welcome.
So let's jump around a little bit, but let me ask you about this one set of experiences that you had and people in your squadron had. So you and a few people in the squadron either detected UFOs on your instruments or saw them directly. Tell me the full story of these UFO sightings, and the smallest technical details, because I love those.
I'll do my best. So we returned from, and when I say we, I mean not my squadron, but VFA 11, the Red Rippers. I was a somewhat junior pilot at the time. I joined them on deployment in 2012, where they had been already out there for about 6 months or so, operating in the vicinity of Afghanistan. I joined them, and then we flew back, and still as a relatively new guy, we came back and we entered what's considered a maintenance phase, where we slow down the tactical flying a bit, kind of recuperate, do some maintenance on the aircraft. And our particular model of the F-18, the lot number, was plumbed for the particular things that were needed to upgrade the radar from what's known as the APG-73 to the APG-79. And the APG-73 is a mechanically scanned array radar. It's a perfectly fine radar, but the ACER radar is kind of a magnitude jump in capability, kind of an analog digital kind of mindset.
So it's a leap to digital. APG-73, 79. Are these things on a carrier? Like, what are we talking about here?
This is
how big is the radar?
Yeah. So this is actually the radar. It's in the F-18 itself.
Okay. So when you say they were chosen, this is to test the upgrade to the 79, APG-79.
Less of a test and more of just, hey, it's your turn to get the upgrade. Like, we're all going to these better radars. They were building ones off the line with the new radar. But we were this weird transitionary squadron in the middle that transitioned from the older ones to the new ones. But it's not particularly rare to fly with different types of radar, because in we call the fleet replacement squadron, essentially the training ground for the F-18, you have all sorts of F-18s with different radars. So you are used to having multiple ones. But in the actual deployable combat squadron, we upgraded. And when we upgraded, we saw that there were objects on the radar that we were seeing the next day with this new radar that weren't there with the old radar. And these were sometimes, the same day. You might go on 2 flights. The one in the morning might be with the older radar, the one in the evening with the new radar. And you'd see the objects with the new radar. And that's not overly surprising in some sense. They are more sensitive. Perhaps they're not filtering out everything they should be yet, or perhaps there's some other type of error. Maybe it needs to be calibrated, whatever. It was relatively new, and we were somewhat used to there being software problems with these types of things occasionally, just like anything else. And so, okay, maybe this is a radar software malfunction. We're getting some false tracks, as we call them.
What were you seeing?
And so what we would see are representations of the object. So this is off of our radar. We're not seeing a visual image here. This is kind of like what's being displayed to us, almost like in a gaming fashion, right? Like the icon, right? So the icon is showing us, hey, something is there, and here's the parameters I can understand about it.
So this is in the cockpit. There's a display that's showing some visualization of what the radar is detecting.
Correct. And there's two different ways to do that. The first one is like the actual data, like the radar, where it's showing me the data kind of as if it's in front of me and I'm selecting those contacts. And there's another screen called the situational awareness page, and that's kind of a God's eye view that brings all that data into one spot. And so I'm going to talk about this from the SA page, from the situational awareness page, versus the individual radar ones, because it's easier. But
sorry to link on that. So the individual displays are like first person, and then the SA is, when you say God's eye view, is like from the top, the integration of all that information as if it's looking down onto the Earth.
Yes.
Is that a good way to summarize it?
It is, but for the aviator, it's slightly different because those two radar displays I talked about are at the bottom of that display is kind of representative of where I am, and so I see what's in front of me.
Got it.
Whereas the situational awareness page, the aircraft is located in the center of that, and then all around me, based off of the data link and wherever I'm getting information from, I can see that whole awareness page. I can see all the situation. So I'm going to kind of talk about this from the situational awareness page, which is a top-down view, just to kind of frame our minds instead of jumping around. And so what we would see out there is we'd see these indications that something would be there, and they would have a track file. That track file, that thing that represents the object, has a line coming out of it, and that represents, it's called the target aspect indicator.
And there's some tracking from the radar.
Correct. So it's showing you where the objects are.
This is all pretty cool that the radar can do all this. So the radar locks in on the different objects and it tracks them over time.
Correct.
That's coming from the radar. That's a built-in feature.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Cool.
So out there we're seeing it. And so we don't have to necessarily pull things into our tracker in some sense, right? Like it's all out there, and then we can kind of choose to highlight on stuff or to kind of focus in on it more so. But the information should all be out there. And so we'd see that target aspect indicator, that line, on a typical aircraft, it would kind of look like this. It would be coming out and it would go steady, and if they turn, it would be like, and you see them turn, right? Like, it's not magic. But this object, the target aspect would kind of be like all over the place, like kind of randomly in the 360 degrees, from that top-down view, that line would be made place. So kind of, is it unable to determine the target aspect? Is it stationary? And that's just how it puts it out and it's not used to seeing. And so I'm not saying that's necessarily super weird, but it was different than what we were used to seeing because we weren't used to seeing stationary objects out there very much. And what was also interesting is that these weren't just stationary on a zero wind day, right? These are stationary 20,000 feet, 15,000 feet, 500 feet, with the wind blowing, And so much like the sea, when we're up there fighting, it affects everything. We consider the wind when we're, shooting missiles, when we're flying, or fuel considerations. It's like operating, in that volume of air, like the ocean. Everything's going with the current. And so anything that doesn't go with the current, is immediately kind of identifiable and strange. And that's why these were initially strange, is because they would be stationary against them.
So if you had something like a good drone in the windy conditions, what would that look like? Would it not come off as stationary? Would it sort of float about, kind of thing?
No, I think with the drone technology we have today, they could stay within a pretty tight location.
Well, I meant like DJI drone, not like I'm saying like generically speaking.
I would
not a military drone.
No, I have a DJI drone myself even, and maybe not 100 knots, but if that thing's in 30 or 40 knot winds, the amount of distance it's going to be kind of doing one of these, like that change is not something we detect from maybe many miles away.
Interesting.
So it could look very stationary. But that wasn't necessarily, and what's interesting about this story is that there's not like the one smoking gun, right? You have to kind of look at everything. And that's what, I don't like about the Department of Defense and just generally people's take on this is that everything is kind of based around a single image, or that one case. But a lot of the interestingness comes from the duration or the time it's been out there, how they're interacting relative to other objects out there. And you don't get that information when you just look at a frame for a second, Everyone kind of bites off on the shiny object. But
so you yourself from your particular slice of things you've experienced and seen directly or indirectly, you've kind of built up an intuition about what are the things that were being seen?
I wouldn't go that far. I've just been able to, eliminate some variables because of how long I've observed it. So, like you said, yes, can a drone stay in a particular position against the wind like that? Certainly. But I don't think it can do that and then go 0.8 Mach for 4 hours after that, And so when you look at it outside of that moment in time, then it eliminates a lot of the potential things it could be, at least from my perspective.
So what kind of stuff did you see in the instruments?
We'd see them flying in patterns, kind of racetrack patterns or circular patterns, or just going kind of straight east. I'd occasionally see them supersonic, 1.1, 1.2 Mach, but typically 0.6 to 0.8 Mach, just for extremely extended periods of time, essentially all the time. And this is airspace where there's not supposed to be anything else at all, and it's pretty far out there. It starts 10 miles off the coast, goes to like 300 miles.
Can you say the location that we're talking about?
Off the coast of Virginia Beach.
Got it. And so nobody is supposed to be out there.
It's possible for people to be there. It's not necessarily restricted, but it's well monitored, and we're out there every day, all day. And so, people know to stay clear. If a Cessna goes bumbling in there, everyone's going to know about it. The FAA is going to, call them out. It's going to tell us about it. So, incursions happen, not a big deal, but they're pretty rare, honestly, because everyone knows the area, and we've been operating there for decades.
And what are the trajectories at 0.6 to 0.8 Mach that these objects were taking?
Typically, they would be in some type of circular pattern or kind of racetrack pattern when they were at those speeds, or I just see them kind of, and it wasn't always like a mechanical flight description. And when I say that, I mean like an autopilot is going to be just very precise, right? It's going to be locked on straight, and whereas I could see an airplane, I could tell if the pilot's flying it, right? Because it's not going to be perfect. The computer's not controlling it. And these seemed more like that. Not that they were imprecise, but that they were even much more erratic than that. So, like, it wasn't like a straight line in a turn. It was just kind of like a, weird drift like that in that direction,
So it wasn't controlled by a dumb computer. Or, no disrespect to computers. So it wasn't controlled by autopilot kind of technology.
That's not the sense that I got.
So how many people have seen them in the squadron? Sort of how many times were they seen? How many, were there times when there's multiple objects?
Once we started seeing them on the radar enough, and we would get close enough, we'd actually see them on our FLIR as well. So our advanced targeting pod, it's essentially a infrared camera that we use for targeting, mostly in the air-to-surface environment. We don't use it in the air-to-air arena. It's just not that good of a tool, frankly. But we would see higher energy emitting from that location where the radar was dropping us off. So, the radar, we'd lock onto the object, and our sensors would all look there. And so then we could see that it's looking at that right piece of sky, but there's energy actually coming from there. So now we started thinking that, okay, maybe not radar malfunctions, maybe something is physically here, of course, and then people started to try to fly by it and see it. And at this point, I would say maybe 80 to 90% of our squadron had probably seen one of these on the radar at this point. Everyone was aware of it. There was small communication, I think, between squadrons of the same area that had the same radar. So I knew it wasn't just our squadron for whatever strange reason, because other squadrons would be out there, and we would talk to them, hey, like, careful, there's an object, are you aware of that, So, like, they would be aware of it. And then, of course, people would want to go see what they look like, right? So people would try to fly by it. I'd try to fly by it.
I like how that's an of course.
Of course.
Of course you want to fly by it. There's an argument against that kind of perspective, that maybe the thing is dangerous, so maybe we don't. But perhaps that's part of the reason you want to fly by it, is to understand better what it is if it's a threat.
We have a lot of context now that we didn't back then, and so it was still hey, is this a balloon, is this a drone, at a certain point. And we're also aware of, potential intelligence gathering operations that could be going on. We're up there flying our tactics, we're emitting, we're practicing our EW, we're turning at particular times. Like, there's stuff that can be learned. It's not a secret. And, countries keep different fishing vessels and whatnot in international waters off there, so it's not exactly a secret that we're being observed out there. So to think that a foreign hostile or a foreign nation would want to, somehow intercept information, whether that's our radar signals or our jamming capabilities, to try to break that down or understand it better, be ready for that next fight. that's what scares me about this scenario, because we didn't jump right to aliens or UFOs. We thought, this is a radar malfunction we need to be aware of. It's a safety issue. And then, this could be a tactical problem right here, because everything we do is based off of crypto and locations. Everything's classified. We do it, right? And so over time, if you gather enough data about those flights and just monitor them forever, just like some nations do with other pieces of technology or software, they could probably learn a lot. So we have to be confident of that and defending it.
So what can you say about the other characteristics of these objects, like shape, size, texture, luminosity? How else do you describe object? Is there something that could be said? So you said, like, this detect on radar, step one. Now you have FLIR images that can give you a sense that there's actually a physical object. What else can be said about those physical objects?
So eventually someone did see one with their own eyeballs, multiple people, and they saw it in a somewhat interesting way. The object presented itself at the exact altitude and geographic location of the entry points into our working areas. So we enter at a very specific point at a certain altitude, and people leave the areas the same point at a lower altitude. Probably one of the busiest pieces of sky on the eastern seaboard. So 2 jets from my squadron went out, and they went flying, and they entered the area, and one of these objects went right between the aircraft.
As they're flying in formation, and the object went between the aircraft.
They went between the object, I think. I don't think that the object was moving. I don't think it aggressively went at them. I think it was located still there, and then they flew through it. But they didn't have it on their radar. And that would, I think the radar might have been malfunctioning. I don't know that for sure. I would like to look into it, but my supposition is that if their radar was malfunctioning, it would make sense that they wouldn't avoid the object that was there, because they knew these were physical at that point. And we would go up to these objects all the time and try to see them. We couldn't see them, and we didn't know what it was. Were they just not there? Were they being fooled? Was something happening? Were they moving, dropping altitude the last minute? We're going by pretty quick, so it's difficult to tell. But perhaps if his radar wasn't working, it wasn't receiving energy from the jet, and the jet, of course, didn't know that it was there, and so whatever the case was, they flew right by, and they described it just as a dark gray or black cube inside a clear, translucent sphere, and the apexes of the cube were touching the inside of that sphere.
That's an image that's haunting. So what did they think it is? What did they think at that moment? Is it just this kind of cloud of uncertainty that they're just describing a geometric object? It's not on radar, so it's unclear what it is. What was any kind of other description they've had of it in terms of the intuition from a pilot's perspective? You have to kind of identify what a thing is.
To answer the first part, they actually canceled the flight and came back, because they were, it's like, if there's one of these out here and one was hitting them and it's right there, then, perhaps we need to get a different jet with better radar. And so they came back, and they're in their gear, and they're talking to the front desk and talking to the skipper, and like, hey, we almost hit one of those damn things out there. And this kind of was one of those kind of slight watershed moments where we all were kind of like, all right, like, this is a serious deal now. Yeah. Maybe we thought they were balloons or drones or malfunctions, or maybe we thought it was fine, but at the end of the day, if we're going to hit one of these things, then we need to take care of the situation. And that's actually when we started submitting hazard reports or HAZREPs to the Naval Aviation Safety kind of communication network. And it's not like a big proactive thing where people go investigate. It's more of a data collection mechanism so that you can kind of share that aggregate data and make sure things are progressing. So it wasn't a mechanism that would result in action being taken, but we were hoping to at least get the message out to whomever was maybe running a classified program that we were not aware of, or something like that, that, hey, like, you could kill somebody here. Like, you've grown too big for your britches here. Take a step back. So that was our concern at that point. That's kind of where we were thinking this was going.
What's the protocol for shooting at a thing? Was there a concern that it's a direct threat, not just surveillance, but a thing that could be, a threat?
At least from my perspective, like, that never really crossed into my mind. I thought it was potentially an intelligence, failure that could be being watched and information gathered. But I didn't think that it was something that would proactively engage me in a hostile manner. it wouldn't really make sense either to. It would be shocking to like have one of these objects take out an F-18, but there's no real tactical advantage other than fear, perhaps.
Psychological.
Yeah.
I've learned a lot about the psychological warfare in Ukraine, as there's a big part of the war in terms of when you talk about siege warfare, about wars that last for many years, for many months, and then perhaps could extend to years. But yes, it didn't fit your conception of a threatening entity.
Correct.
So looking back now, from all the pieces of data you've integrated, you've personally added, what do you think it could be?
I don't know. I don't know what it could be. I think we've been able to categorize it successfully into a few buckets. We've been able to say that, this could be U.S. technology that someone put in the wrong piece of sky, or perhaps was developed and tested in an inappropriate spot by someone that wasn't obeying best practices.
Is there, sorry to interrupt, is there a sort of modularity to the way the military operates, the way it's possible for one branch not to know about the tests of another?
Yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable to think that could occur, right? And so if we just make that assumption, we can integrate that into our analysis here and just say, okay, but at the point we're at now, we have to assume that that's not the case, right? With everything that's been going on and the statements that have been made and the hearings, I think that if it was a non-communication issue, we're in big trouble at this point.
What about it being an object from another nation, from China, from Russia?
Or even one of our allies, perhaps, right? Maybe that's, I don't think it's controversial to say that our allies could be gathering information about us or anything of that nature, but that would be an extreme case. But I think it's just important to say, right, to not just say Russia or China and just call them the bad guys and assume that if they don't have, no one can do it. And so from my perspective, anyone else, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a foreign power. It could be a non-government entity, perhaps, although I think that's very unlikely. But again, these are things you must consider if you kind of throw everything other than the U.S. under scrutiny. But from what has been reported and the behaviors that have been seen, I would expect to see remnants of that technology elsewhere in the economy. There seems to be too many things that require advanced technology that would be beneficial commercially as well as in other military applications for it to be completely locked away by one of our competitors. Now, I could see us perhaps locking something away if we're already in the lead and having it to pull out as needed. But for someone that's perhaps in a power struggle and they're in second place, they might be more aggressive with the development of different types of technology, willing to accept bigger risks.
Do you think it could be natural phenomena that we don't yet understand?
I think that there are a number of things that this is going to be, right? I don't think there's one thing at the end of the day, but I certainly think that is part of what some of this could be. I don't think it's what we were seeing on the East Coast, and I don't think it is related to the Roosevelt incident, or I'll even go out and say the Nimitz incident, but
what's the Roosevelt incident?
The Roosevelt incident, typically referred to as the gimbal, or the Go Fast video.
And then Nimitz is from what the David Fravor was directly spoken about. So we'll talk about that as well. I'd just love to get your sort of interpretation of those incidents. But yeah, so in this particular case, natural phenomena could be a part of the picture, but you're saying not the whole picture.
Yes, and we can't discount it.
Oh, the other thing is, what about the failure of pilot eyesight? Like, sort of some deep mixture of actual direct vision, human vision system failure, and, like, psychology. Like, seeing something weird, and then filling in the gaps. Because in order to make sense of the weird.
I've tried to expose myself to scenarios like that I don't necessarily think are right, but I've explored them to see if they could have some truth. And one example is, let's imagine a scenario where if we're seeing these objects every day off the East Coast, I can imagine a technology or an operation where you had some type of traditional propulsion system operating drones in order to gather data like we had discussed. And I could envision a clever enough adversary that could perhaps destroy or somehow remove these objects and replace them with new objects, essentially when we're not looking, right? And that accounts for the large airborne time. And so I explore options like that, and I try to see, you know, what evidence and assumptions need to be made in order to prove or disprove that. And, you know, you would need so much infrastructure, you know, you'd need so many assets. And so I try to explore some of those fallacies and some of those.
You calling for some wheels? I'm Johnny on the spot. I'll hook you up.
Like actual physical, like eyesight and kind of illusion training. So like at nighttime flying, there's so many things that can happen, flying with false horizons. And so we receive hours of training.
It's on the way.
That type of stuff. But this just falls outside the category from my perspective.
What was the visibility conditions when in the times when people were able to see it? And then, we just earlier discussed complete nighttime, darkness. In this case, was it during the day?
It was a perfectly clear day, that particular incident.
In a world that's full of mystery, I have to ask, what do you think is the possibility that it's not of this Earth origin?
I like the term non-human intelligence in a sense, because again, there's a lot of assumptions in there that may cause us to go down the wrong roads. It could, you know, these could be something that are weather phenomena of Earth, right? Or something else that is just something we don't understand and can't imagine right now that's still this Earth. If we consider extraterrestrial or something that came from a physical place far away in space-time, you know, that leads us to some detection assumptions that we would need to make. And so I just try to not categorize it under anything and just say, hey, is this demonstrating intelligence? And start from there as a single object. What can we learn about it thematically? How it's performing? What does that mean for its energy source? What does that mean for the G-forces inside? And then step it out a level and say, okay, how are these interacting with our fighters, if they are? How are they interacting with the weather and their environment? How are they interacting with each other? So can we look at these and how they're interacting perhaps as a swarm? Especially off the East Coast, where this is happening all the time with multiple objects, right? And so we may be able to determine some things about their maybe, you know, sensor capabilities or the areas of focus, you know, if we can determine how they're working in conjunction with each other. But, you know, seeing one little flash of an object doesn't provide that type of insight. But we have the systems for it, but it's kind of, you know, an irony, but it's a fact of life, the reality that many of these well-deployed, highly capable systems are held under the military umbrella, which makes it difficult to provide that data for scientific analysis.
There's probably a lot of data on these objects. It's not made available, probably even within the military for analysis.
I think so. Yeah, I think there's a lot of data that can be made available. And, you know, that's one of the reasons why, you know, I've been engaged with the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics to build, you know, a large resources of cross-domain expertise so that if or when that data is available or that there's additional analysis needed, you know, we can spin up those teams and make that analysis.
So there's a recent House Intelligence Subcommittee hearing on UFOs that you were a part of. What was the goal of that hearing? And can you maybe summarize what you heard?
The hearings, from my perspective, seemed a bit disingenuous, kind of top level. I think
who was it run by? Sorry to interrupt, but who were the people involved and what was the goal? The stated goal?
Congressman Andre Carson would chair the committee, and he is, I think, ultimately responsible for bringing it all together. You know, I think the intent of Congress was to try to bring light to what has been happening with the Navy and to help show the American people that Congress is taking it serious because something serious is happening. But in the sense that that seemed a bit disingenuous. They talked around it a lot. They, you know, advertised their love of science fiction. But they, you know, they didn't treat this, I would say, in the manner it deserved as a potential tactical threat if it's coming from a foreign power. And I get it, though. At the same day, they have very specific objectives within the DoD, right? They have a very important job. Their job isn't necessarily to do exploratory science for no reason. So I applaud and I encourage their efforts on the intelligence side to help understand this. But my concern is that they play a role they're not well suited for, which is doing science.
the Pentagon has opened a new office to investigate UFOs called All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. What do you think about this office? Do you think it can help alleviate in the way which this hearing perhaps has failed to improve more the scientific rigor and the seriousness of investigating UFOs?
I think that remains to be seen. I think it's a step in the right direction, but it's a step that was taken because the previous step didn't happen, right? So the AOI-MSG was the progeny, essentially, of the AARO or ARO, and the name was changed because nothing was happening, and it was essentially just a confusing mess of words that were created to make this topic unpalatable. The Airborne Object Identification Synchronization Management Group. Quite a mouthful. I practice that. But the new All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, from my perspective at least the perspective that they're putting out, they seem to want to be open. They put out a Twitter handle. They're going out on Twitter and communicating, saying they want to keep this open. But that's going to run into a classification wall.
Well, so Dr. Sean Patrick seems like an interesting guy.
He does, yes.
So he's got I haven't looked into too deeply, but he seems to have sort of, he's coming from like a science research perspective, background. So he might be at least in the right mindset, the right background to kind of lead a serious investigation.
I think so. I'll just say generally, the office has been receptive to AIAA reaching out in order to collaborate, which has been a positive sign. I'll also pass the same kudos to Dr. Spergel and NASA's effort as well. I see these organizations that are standing up. I do see them as good faith efforts that are coming about through a lot of difficulty and negotiation, most likely, right? And I see these as a small door opening that, if we can take advantage of, can lead to a much more productive relationship between these organizations.
How do you put pressure on this kind of thing? Does it come from the civilian leadership? Does it come from sort of Congress and presidents? Does it come from the public? Does the public have any power to put pressure on this? Or is the giant wall of bureaucracy going to protect it against any public pressure? What do you think?
I think we've been in that latter state for a while, but society seems to be a bit different nowadays. We have the ability to communicate and to group and to form relationships in a way that hadn't been able to be present in the past. We've been able to do research, for better or worse, on our own, in a way that hasn't been able to happen before. And so I sense that people are a bit less willing to kind of buy the bottom line statement from those in power as they used to be, back when they didn't have access to those tools. And so I do think there is a massive role for the general society, general populace to play to show that they are interested in this. Because it's not that I don't think the politicians or the leaders in the Pentagon, it's not that they don't like this topic necessarily or think it's toxic per se, but they exist in a culture where this has been toxic and they don't feel comfortable talking about it. And these are people that have spent their entire careers, working towards a goal and getting to very high positions within government. And so this is very against their nature to take a stance on a topic like this. And so the fact